we have, let's welcome Dan Winter. Amazing, amazing.
So, hello everyone. Welcome for another incredible session of our Geophilia Congress. Today we have the honor to have Dan Winter with us. Such an amazing polymath. Thank you, Dan, for coming today.
I'm happy to be here. My smile is almost as good as your smiles.
So for those of you, which I really don't think you will be new to Dan and Dan's work, but for those of you that you are a bit new, Dan has dedicated his life in really bridging the world of science and spirituality, decoding unified physics, blending sacred geometry, and all of that. And actually, we have a bit of a story to begin with for those of you that you don't know. So first of all, the story goes back with Arturo and Dan. So Arturo, why don't you share with us a little bit how it started?
Yeah, thanks so much, Dan, for being with us. It has just been amazing. More than 20 years ago, I wanted to understand all Dan's theories.
We're that old? Oh my.
We're more than 18.
Oh my gosh.
Just 19, both touching. 19.
So I wanted to actually understand pretty good all the theories of Dan, and at some point I said, okay, I'm going to translate everything into Spanish because that's the best way to understand something, just translating it. So that was, I met Dan online first and then eventually in Tulum in Mexico. And then from there we started organizing many conferences and congress. The first international congress was in Mexico City with Dan, with Aldrich, with Michael. It was just an amazing experience. And then from there we've been doing many, many things together, yes.
And also Dan is kind of our godfather because me and Arturo, we met in the first Fractal Field conference many years ago where I was going to present all about the temple research, and then Arturo was there, and then that's the story. So
it's romantic.
Exactly. So thank you, Dan, for all that, and thank you for all your amazing work. So let's get into the core subjects today. So first of all, share with us a little bit about your interest in blending together sacred geometry, unified physics, and how does that really tie with what we call bioarchitecture?
Yes, well, also in terms of history, remember that I was working with the famous Professor Phil Callahan in Florida, and he taught us how to use live hemp fibers and a brainwave spectrum analyzer to measure the harmonics that cause life force. We could measure a live chicken egg or a tomato, and if it's a very quiet environment, you got this frequency cascade that was a measurement of life. So suddenly, the weak electrical harmonics, which we now know are implosive, identify life. I mean, that was something to meditate on. So it got me thinking, well, how do you build life? And how is life designed? What is life force in actuality? And that's what I've prepared to share a bit about today, specifically. If we reduce the concept of living architecture to core electrical principle, which is specifically that charge collapse, that implosion, the ability to gain energy during that implosive collapse, identifies life force, negentropy, self-organization, makes a seed grow, and makes a building create bliss and children to grow as well. So there's a core principle, and it is geometry. It's sacred geometry in the sense that the harmonics that do that are called conjugate or fractal. And that implosion, that is sacred geometry, is perfect fractality, identifies life force, and you can build that if you understand. And then you get into questions about materials and dielectrics and all that stuff. So I wanted to try to identify core principles electrically today. That was my little idea.
Amazing. For people that have never heard about Phil Callahan, could you just share a bit about his work and paramagnetism? Sure. Maybe people have never heard of these concepts before.
That's right. So Professor Phil Callahan was famous. His book, Tuning into Nature. He was the hero of Acres magazine. He's the guy that figured out that if you measure the magnetic lines, when the magnetic lines break, you can literally predict where war versus peace are going to break out. And then he showed me personally how to measure whether a tree was going to live or die by determining if it was a radio for the Schumann harmonics. Again, charge collapse. So Callahan was quite a pioneer. Now, he also was involved in the infrared model of olfaction, that the insect antenna are literally a bliss antenna. Insects are navigating by the infrared radiance of the carving on the pyramid walls, and that the physics of smell, which is the physics of bliss, is actually a high frequency radio. I mean, all kinds of cool stuff. The guy was, and he was like, I don't know, 70 years old when we interviewed him in Florida. So
amazing.
He was
and what about paramagnetism? Why is that important?
Yeah, so effectively, and then Acres magazine sold a kit designed by Callahan for years to measure the paramagnetism in the soil. And it's basically simple. If the soil is magnetically flux permeable, not only does it predict where war and peace are going to happen, but it predicts fertility, because obviously that is charge distribution efficiency. So certain materials in the soil that make charge distribute, which enable magnetic lines to flow, very simply, magnetic flux, permissivity versus permittivity, identify life force and fertility. And he was a pioneer in that field for sure.
Exactly. And me and you, we talked a lot about all that many years ago when I spent like 2 weeks at your place, and we're discussing about all that and all the PhD I was doing. I remember we had just these incredible discussions. So again, thank you for all these years of amazing support
we were young
and exchange.
We were young then, I'm not sure.
Sorry, what?
We were young then.
Yes, we're still young, though.
But no, I have to admire, Lydia was very bravely, studying in very technical electrical terms what devices can be used to measure and predict geopathic zones. And she pioneered some of that work even at universities not ready to hear it. So Lydia had her share of it too. I honor that for sure.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you so much.
So would you like, maybe you can share screen and we can start.
Yes. Okay.
Diving deep into all this, amazing subjects.
I really had just a couple of slides, really.
It's okay.
I wanted to bring this really to focus. So what we're saying here, actually, it's this slide 24 first. So we're saying that gaining energy during charge collapse, that ability is the reason consciousness exists. It's the reason objects fall to the ground. It's the reason seeds germinate. It's the reason bliss happens. It's the reason pyramids make global wireless power. It's the reason zero-point and vacuum energy work. It's the reason golden ratio is the dominant geometry of orbital mechanics. It's the reason for all action at a distance entanglement is conjugation. So gaining energy during charge collapse, which we now call PlanckFire.com, that is the message of how to make life force. And now, to apply that to architecture, obviously, bioarchitecture in essence is how Mother Nature built the molecules that determine if a seed is alive or dead. And that is precisely what we were measuring with Phil Callahan years ago. You measure the weak electric field of a tomato or an egg, and if you get this cascade of harmonics that looked like this, actually. So I know the picture is a bit small here, but on top, that caduceus, the blue harmonics on top, which you can only barely see, that's my equation, PlanckFire.com, Planck times golden ratio. And then on bottom in green, 3 hertz, 7.83, 14.3, and 20.8, those are the known Schumann harmonics. Again, caduceus, conjugate, fractal, implosive, charge collapse. And right over here is the exact same chart and the exact same frequencies in the harmonics which predict and measure whether you're having bliss and peak attention in your brain waves, gaining energy during charge collapse. And just down below, the last part of this slide. So if you take this cascade of harmonics, and you see originally the equation predicted 7.29 hertz, but of course we know now that Schumann cascade is close but not exact. Schumann cascade is here 7.83 hertz. So you take that cascade up, and we measured 53 and 7.83 and 28 kilohertz, famously in Sam's Bosnian pyramid, where 1 million people a year arrive to get rejuvenation and consistently report they got rejuvenation in Sam's Bosnian pyramid. What is the electric theory there? The theory is that because you are implosively gaining energy during charge collapse, that creates negentropy, self-organization, and also notably negative ions. So,
and for a bit of a beginner here, how could you explain with kind of a simpler way about charge collapse?
Yeah, well, the classic geometry of charge collapse is if you nest the Platonic solids. Oh yeah, I love that background tool. It's really but if you nest the tetracube into the dodecaecosa, the famous Star Mother kit, which is an extremely accurate model of how electron shells nest, extremely accurate model of how the hadrons of the nucleus nest, and a rather accurate model per Kepler of the way planetary orbitals nest. And the reason when you embed Platonic solids one inside the other is perfected charge collapse, because the tetracube inside nests in the dodecaecosa outside, specifically using golden mean ratio, which is implosive fractal charge collapse. So that then became the famous, when the clairvoyants studied the heart of the sun, the heart of the human, and the heart of hydrogen. In each case, they drew exactly the same picture named Anu, 7 spins outside, 5 spins inside, which we now know is a drawing of 7 spins outside, 5 spins inside. It's a drawing of Platonic charge collapse. So if you nest harmonics, visualize the famous dodecaecosa Earth grid, for example. If you nest harmonics using dodecaecosa, all golden ratio, that creates a situation where when the waves converge, using only and precisely golden ratio, they add and multiply recursively, called perfect fractality. And that perfected adding and multiplying recursively optimizes perfected constructive wave interference, and therefore perfected constructive compression. And perfect compression is the solution to basically every problem in physics, like origin of consciousness, the way through death, the reason gravity exists, the physics of alchemy, the history of urban design, the history of computers. It's all about discovering compression. And it is literally electrically the way through death. We won't have the conversation now. So if you want to understand perfect compression, you're identifying the way the charge can move non-destructively through center. And that specifically is fractal geometry enables only that geometry of compression to become acceleration of charge towards center. The name for that acceleration of charge towards center is called the gravity, but it's also called life force. It's the reason focused human attention causes charge to collapse. And conventional physics already agrees charge collapse causes consciousness and causes gravity. What conventional physics has not discovered is the cause of charge collapse. That's the question I have answered. It is PlanckFire.com, Planck times integer multiples of golden ratio, fractality perfected. And that charge collapse is the reason gravity and life force and all those things exist. So when you build that into architecture, you create life because, That's where we're going.
Absolutely. So can you explain for people that are new, what is Planck?
Oh, that's good. That's the right question. So the Planck length and time is a unit of length and time into which every wave in physics divides evenly. Another way of saying it is absolutely agreed. This is the musical key signature of the universe. 1 billion light years in all directions, Planck remains the same. Now you take, that's the resolution of the quantum foam. It's literally God's pixel. and you add and multiply recursively by golden ratio from Planck, and suddenly you got like 200 self-organizing variables in physics. Check out PlanckFire.com. Earth year, galactic year, precessional year, hydrogen radii, Schumann harmonics, brainwave harmonics, heart harmonics, and 200 other key negentropic variables in all of physics. This is predicting charge collapse, and that implosion towards center creates a sorting phenomena at the center called negentropy, and that is the reason life exists. And just to try to finish that thought, why Einstein didn't figure out why objects fall to the ground. He stated correctly that infinite non-destructive charge collapse was the cause of gravity, but he could not figure out where the charge went when it went through the center. This is a problem. And that's the question we have answered very, very specifically The waves are adding and multiplying recursively, and they reach the Planck threshold. And at that point, the transverse EMF, up and down wave, is converted to compressional, longitudinal, scalar, torsional, which defines gravity waves, defines all action at a distance, defines life and centripetal force. And so when wave travels through center and implodes and propagates longitudinally, it becomes coherent for long distance propagation because it bounces at fractal nodes. And those fractal nodes become not just the Earth grid, but the definitive song line, ancestor memory. And that coherent longitudinal that's emitted from the implosion is the only definition of lucid dreaming and who has a soul, for example.
So, from all your work, I think you have, like, let's say, extracted everything or concluded into many different things that begin with two main, let's say, parameters, right? So one is the golden mean and the other is the Planck length. And so for people that are, kind of new, basically what Dan is trying to say is that the core geometry of how the universe works is the golden mean because that creates perfect fractality. Trying to explain basically that that's the way we have the constructive wave interference. Like all the waves can embed together in the most harmonic way, to say it in a simple term, through the golden mean, and we create a higher level of fractality. And also that's why all the ancient temples have embedded this golden ratio almost everywhere, all around the world, across different civilizations, across different cultures, across different timelines also. And I find that remarkable. And the other interesting aspect is the Planck length, that from there, so the work of John Mitchell and your work, and, we're also working on that as well through architecture, is taking that Planck length and then multiplying it with golden mean in different powers, and then you get all the ancient sacred measures. And
that's right, sacred dimension.
Yeah, exactly. So you have the foot and you have the cubit,
so
and you have all these.
Sacred dimension, the British foot is a good example. Sacred dimension is defined by charge collapse, because when you invite charge collapse, that's called sacred because it's imploding. And just one more, your description was perfect, but just one more little note. It was known before that golden mean was the definition of beauty and romance and poetry. But we did one more thing. We published the generalized wave equations to prove that golden ratio is the solution to constructive wave interference in general, and therefore the solution to compression, therefore the solution to implosion, collapse, and fractality. So we did the wave mechanic equations to put solid physics behind what's obviously an ancient romance.
Yeah. So these two core concepts, and then what you did, blending them together and defining different things across different scales, I find it always fascinating. And actually, we have kind of condensed part of this, and we share that in our Geophilia Masters course. We do that in Module 1, which we try to explain how modern physics is absolutely correlated with sacred geometry and architecture. It's all one thing at the end. It might sound to people that these are just completely different subjects, right? How does unified physics have to do with architecture? But it's actually one thing, in my opinion, and I know you would agree also. But in ancient times, they already knew all that, right? Because it's already embedded on these ancient structures. So they knew how to design. What we are teaching also with Arturo is how does the universe designing the microcosm, so the very, very small world, the world of Planck, and the quantum world, and then how does the universe designing the macrocosm, the very, very big scales, and how are we here in the mesocosm, trying to be architects, and we forget about everything else. So if we want to be conscious in the spaces we're creating or designing, then we have to bring, all the wisdom from the micro and the macro and create that continuation of fractality across the different scales. So that's something really important. And Arturo is also releasing now his course, which is called Cosmic Design, linking the micro, macro, and mesocosm. So that's going to be epic for everybody listening. Nice. Yeah,
Arturo has put together some wonderful books. It's great work. I just wanted to say, I was thinking about the design of the Parthenon there, and obviously that was golden ratio. And not only did they know to use the ratio correctly, but they knew how to use the scale correctly. And they knew how to use the materials correctly. And I remember my nightmare when I arrived in the Parthenon, and see, they had all these beautiful paramagnetic, implosive, capacitive sacred space. And in the modern day, they surrounded the place with this obscene steel rope all over the
Oh, yeah.
completely destroying.
It's still there. Still there, Dan.
It just underlines, and they did the same in Scotland. So point being that after you know the physics of how you make a living capacitor implosive charge, then you have these issues, not only the geometry, but then the scale and the ratio, and then the material, which are called high dielectric and high piezo, to enable implosive capacitance. And in those circumstances, actually, the definition that you have succeeded is not that you got the measurements right. That's only the start. The definition of success is actually the measurement of the electric field you made. Is it implosive? And you can measure whether that's going to make a seed or a child grow. Because remember, when Mother Nature put the molecules together to make a seed alive, Mother Nature knew it had to really suck, or if it could not attract that first nutrient, it had to be implosive. And that's the definition of life, and you can design that if you know what life is.
Exactly. Just a small parenthesis, I would like to share a story that I think also will interest you, Dan. But when I was 18, I got, I would say, the honor of actually entering the Parthenon inside, because the professor of history of architecture in the University of Athens here of architecture, he was and he still is the one that is responsible for the rehabilitation and the restoration of the Parthenon. So we got to enter the temple, 100 of us from the whole year of architecture. And that time there was no metal or anything. And also I didn't know the things I know today. But what I want to share with you, Dan, and with the people listening, is that I had a really interesting experience, a very profound experience, as I walked up the few steps to go in. And at the time that I was inside the enclosure of the Parthenon, I literally felt that I entered a bubble, like another world. And I don't have words to describe that. I was not yet in my spiritual path. That started around my 21. So I remember a profound feeling that I just started looking around, and I was like, I just made a few steps, up the stairs. Why does it feel so different inside versus the outside? And I'm so glad that all these years, I have done so much research and learned from many amazing people, including you, to understand the physics of all that. And actually, I have this course that also is coming out, which is called the Sacred Science of Ancient Temples. And I'm just decoding exactly what you mentioned, Dan. So we have the three main parameters, which are, firstly is the earth location, which is what I devoted to my PhD, if you remember. Then it's the actual design of the temple, which has exactly these three parameters that you mentioned. So it's the building materials, and I break down exactly what it needs to be. Then we have the geometry and the form and the shape, but then you touch base on something that almost no one talks about, and I'm decoding that also that in the course, which is dimension. So as an architect, you have the shape or the form, you have the materials, but what size are you going to bring that to? That makes a huge difference, especially when you're creating a temple space or a healing space or a meditation space. And that's where all that is so important. And then, of course, we have the sky connection, the celestial connection, and it's exactly what you're describing. So for anybody interested to know all the mechanics and the technology of the ancient temples, you can learn that in this course. And I'm going to be very happy to see you there.
It's wonderful that you're implementing these ideas and making them shareable. It's fabulous. And just the final note on that was that, the definition of success is the electric field. That does it implode? Does it make compression well? And that relates to just what Lydia is saying, is that all of the ancient temples were based on sacred metrology, units of length, which are sacred dimension, because the scale determines if it's going to implode through Planck, defining sacred dimension, sacred length. And also, the other major point, in terms of the placement on the Earth grid, every single one of those ancient sacred sites were on the dodecacosa for a very specific reason. Where the magnetic lines cross, you get that compression. And the available of that compression into those nodes, it's called longitudinal interferometry. That is the physics of DNA radio. It's the only place that global efficient telepathy has been measured, has a dramatic effect on nuclear critical mass. It's literally the definition of sacred space. And so then if you do your Agnihotra or your sacred building or labyrinth,
Yes.
you have the location, and then there's a timing issue too. Sunrise and sunset as Agnihotra.
Yes.
So all of these are ways to access the longitudinal node, and that's the physics of DNA, radio, and telepathy, because that's what the ancestors called the song lines, the dreaming tracks.
And Dan, many times I've been thinking about if we as the universe, as the biological consciousness of the universe, why do you think there are so many houses all around the world, like buildings, houses, offices, all built in 90-degree angles, like square root of 2, almost no phi ratio? Why do you think that happens?
Yeah, well, I'm remembering my years studying with Bucky Fuller. He was my buddy at University of Detroit in Florence. And his life was about efficiency of use of materials. And so he proved that if you stellate a tetra, you could make the geodesic. Unfortunately, his geodesics, particularly the ones in metal, were some of the most geopathic structures in history. And a sphere is unhealthy for biology in general because it's mono frequency. It's only one wavelength. So, there are people who studied efficiency and use of materials in biologic architecture, like Bucky Fuller, amazing guy, but who totally missed the point, absolutely did not get it. Bucky designed our metal geodesic dome in the Biodome in North Carolina, and it was the most geopathic thing you could ever want to step inside of. It was horrible. And the Bucky Fuller Institute today still has the same stupidity. They actually don't know that. So basically, the problem is that we studied efficiency of use of materials, but we didn't know what life is. The core issue, that's why I wanted to start with pure principle here, is that life force is implosive compression and seeds are implosive compression. So that until you know the cause of anything centripetal, and this is a core issue, physics does not appear to know why anything is electrically centripetal. Consciousness is centripetal, gravity is centripetal, life force is centripetal. And physics cannot answer the question of why anything is centripetal, so obviously doesn't have a clue why objects fall to the ground. And until you can answer those questions intelligently, you can't build biologic architecture because biology is electrically centripetal.
So what is your opinion about why everything is 90-degree angle? Like
mostly, let's say.
Mostly.
And also we have been exploring a lot, like, okay, many people cannot just get out of their house and build a new house. Practically speaking, people that have their house 90-degree squares over squares over squares in a square, city, we've been implementing maybe changes of the angles of certain walls, or implementing fractal geometry under the floor, doing all these changes so they can actually
changing the layout internally.
Yeah. I'm thinking of my partner 30 years ago, Gus Ciccacci, who introduced me to Bucky Fuller. And Gus Ciccacci built his house. It was a top-down view of one rung on the ladder of DNA. That was his house. So you had a hex, a pent, a hex, and then a golden ratio. And it was very useful, instructive. He said correctly at the time, in the hex, shadow of a cube, you have the perfect condition for charge isolation. So this is where you want your secrets. Whereas in the pent part of the house, golden ratio implosion, this is where you can have no secrets.
Exactly.
And so this really tends to, there's some places where you want to isolate charge, and that's where your secrets are, and some place where you want to distribute charge. And this is a metaphor then as we design our buildings. Well, where's my private space and where's my public space? It's where charge distribution versus charge isolation. It's very simple physics.
So what Don is trying to say, and this is also something that we implement and we also teach, is there are different geometries for different things, because people always ask us that question, oh, what is the best geometry for everything? But there is no one best geometry for everything, depending, as Dan said, are you doing a private space? Are you doing a public space? Is it a temple? Is it a house? I always say that the design of these two are very different. And so there are many different parameters. But Dan, can you just break down for our audience a little bit, what is the physics in the issue of 90-degree angles and how that relates to the green color?
Well, yeah, we have the very detailed article on that, fractalfield.com/fractal photosynthesis. And basically, first you identify the only two very narrow color bandwidths which create photosynthesis. It's a basic an orange and a purple. And it turns out that those frequencies are exactly golden ratio towards Planck. So photosynthesis exists absolutely because of phase conjugation of Planck. That's the reason photosynthesis exists and is negentropic. And exactly halfway between the color wavelength that actively prevents photosynthesis, called green. So, and they have this idea of the negative green in psychotronics, and green energy can kill you. And basically, it's the reason every living plant spits out the green photon, because it can't be swallowed. It can't implode. You can't gain energy during charge collapse with green. Well, then if you look at it in more detail, not only is phase conjugation evidently and clearly in physics exists because of photosynthesis exists because of phase conjugation, for sure. It cannot be argued. But also we extend that further to say that rainbow, actually the physics of color itself, exists because of phase conjugation. And that takes a more detailed model. You can read about the article, fractalfield.com/fractal photosynthesis. Basically, the visible spectrum is approximately 1 octave because the photon travels as a torus, obviously. And the phase angle or tilt of that photon or torus from 0 to 180 degrees, if you map that along the wavelengths that we call primary colors, you get something that's incredible. You get all of the primary colors are either 45, 90, or 135 degrees pure cubic, except for 2, blue and yellow, I believe, which are 117. And the only 2 colors that are not cubic angles, by the way, green is a cubic angle, yellow and blue, are exactly the internal versus external angle of the face of a dodecahedron. Hello, you nest the photons in the face angles of a cube and a dodecahedron, and you get absolutely the physics of why the primary colors exist. So this then takes you back into the physics of why you get rainbows when Tibetan saints die. They added implosive capacitance to the air, which is the reason rainbows form. I mean, this is a fun subject.
What about 90-degree angle, like inside of buildings? Why is that a problem from the physics perspective? Could you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, at first you would say, well, 90-degree angles is how you have 4-wave mixing in phase conjugate optics, which is true. However, when we study this in more depth, we see that 90-degree angles and octave geometries in general, when we did the equations, we showed, and again, this is all in book, plankfire.com, but octave geometries in general, specifically the octave, powers of 2, including the 90-degree angle, the cubic angle, octave geometries in general maximize destructive heterodyning, destructive wave interference, which is a perfect way to isolate charge. The shadow of a cube of hex makes a snowflake because this is ice, it isolates charge beautifully. There's some things where you want to isolate charge. But if you want to distribute charge, then you're going to need Pent and golden ratio, and nature uses that. So basically, the reason Feng Shui calls 90-degree angles evil is actually literally destructive wave interference, and therefore the inability of capacitance, charge, life force to breathe.
And would you say there is any, let's say, any way that the 90-degree angle can be implemented and it can be beneficial, in your opinion, or that's a no?
Well, it's obviously a bit of a complex question, but,
I know.
The ancients were right about what they call the sacred 4 directions, and those are 90-degree angles, because that's the only way lasers can phase conjugate. But when you're making a capacitor to store life or to implode charge, then a 90-degree angle is not going to help you, actually, because literally it will cause destructive interference right at the point of the 90. And you can actually make a capacitor in a square and look at the aura of the arc and prove that.
Yes.
In astrology they say 90 degrees is stressful. Well, actually they had some of that right.
Yeah. And basically, what if we like soften, because this is like this is a technique also from ancient architectural design ways to make spaces more harmonic. So what if we create softer angles in between the 90-degree and we avoid that? In my opinion, I have seen that can make a difference. And also, I have observed several temples around the world that are based on a square or a rectangle. Basically, they do have 90-degree, but they have, as we have discussed many times, like they have such a higher level of fractality that you never actually get to see an angle like this or like this, right? Either the outside or the inside, because it has so much detail and so much fractal contour that this 90-degree angle almost disappears.
And that, I think that was really explicitly part of Vastu, the way this was taught in the Orient, that you're always softening, and you put something in the corner that softens the chart. So absolutely right. Basically, we knew that the calculus of curvature, which is the physics of the quality of grace, even in motion, was actually the quality of charge distribution. And obviously that perfected curvature defines architecture, how, for example, pine cones make life by imploding the perfect curvature.
So, in the vector flexor that you go from the cubocta to the icosadodeca, and you have this dance between, exactly that one. You have this dance between the, let's say, the square root of 2, like the 2 times, the multiplication, and then the phi ratio, the icosadodeca. So, can be like this dance between these 2 geometries, and then how they can be extrapolated.
No, that's a very good point. Basically, the reason the Anu 7 spins 7 spins outside, 5 spins inside. The 7 spins is the 7 arrows of the tetracube. So that said that the Anu, the shape of human heart muscle, for example, 7 layers based on the 7 spins of tetra, starts with a tetracube. Absolutely. You cannot get stable enough to do implosion unless you start with a tetracube. And then, after you have that stability, then you can weave, embed around that the dodecacosa and do the implosion. But if you try to do the implosion without, you have total instability, basically. So you need both to do the charge spot. The tetracube is the beginning, and the pentodeca is the climax. And that's even Drunvalo taught last step of the Merkaba meditation,
Yeah, and it will be like let's say the capacitor will be the best shape for a capacitor to distribute all this energy. Pentagon, icosadodeca, and then let's say a battery to hold the energy will be the best way to do it, will be with square geometries.
Well, and if someone with a bit of physics background were looking at this question, the best place to start would be molecular chemistry, really. The S suborbitals, there's only a SPDF, that's all the electron shells have for suborbital geometry. S suborbital is simply a torus. The pi suborbital is tetracubic, and atoms which have a tetracube pi suborbital as the outer electron, that establishes the power in their chemistry. In that case, they will put a hex on you. I mean, they will fix the spin. Whereas where the outer electron shells is the DF, dodecacosa suborbital, then you have the noble gases and the platinum group metals implosion, literally golden alchemy. So the chemistry of what the pi suborbital does when it's the outer valence versus what a completed DF suborbital does, gold, palladium, platinum, or noble gases, is opposite, literally. And so that's a way to study electrically how nature uses the difference between tetracube, pi suborbital, versus DF suborbital completion, which is the physics of gold and alchemy.
Absolutely. And you have made many inventions, like one that we actually love absolutely is the ultra imploder. Like you change the surface tension of water and the molecular structure of water, so you can apply that, for example, to increase the availability, the bioavailability of water. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, exactly, and also to say that this is an amazing product that we also have in our Geophilia shop, and we have used it in several projects, and also spa, for healing water, but it's also for drinking your water. It makes water very highly fractal and very hydrating. But Dan will give us now the download about how he created that.
Well, actually, there's like a 50-page graphic history of the imploder at theimploder.com. Lots of pictures. And I spent literally 20 years dreaming that together. But it started with a very simple idea. I knew, I started building the Star Mother kit like almost 50 years ago. But there's a 60-degree vortex cone into every face of that dodecacosa, infinite stellation, perfectly fractal. And that 60-degree cone is identified literally and exactly and precisely by 5 and 10 spirals of the golden mean traveling down that cone, side view, caduceus. And so I knew that like 50 years ago, and I was absolutely mesmerized by that geometry. I knew that if you could build that, you would get magic in 100 different ways. So I started doing 3D graphic plots, and eventually I designed this cone with 5 and 10 spirals going down the perfect cone, literally defining hydrogen, for example. And so now I had the perfect vortex cone for sure, and we could also scale it now by Plant Fire. And so then we did 3D injection molding, and then our friends in UK discovered that if you put that vortex into a magnetic array, we were getting 2 and 300% plant growth improvement, particularly when you had very hard water, because it's wonderful for hard water. Because the capacitance is implosion with piezoelectric. So out the nose cone of that vortex, highly piezo, then suddenly you dump it into this implosive, strong magnetic field, and the reduced molecular cluster size is dramatic, and thus solubility, hydration. So that's the beginning of the story, and there's lots of graphics there. But yeah, so then the imploder.com was based around that original nozzle for many years. And then we extended that to super imploder and now the stainless ultra imploder. And now recently, we have joined forces with Jason at fractalwater.com, a major investor and major partners. And we're relaunching the entire line, a dramatically improved design. Specifically, the injection molding for that cone originally provided a limitation, which was pressure. So if you want to be commercial, we were at about 60 to 90 psi max pressure with the conventional cone. Well, we fixed that. We have a much thicker wall now, and we can go over 100 psi and do all kinds of magic stuff with a higher pressure, more commercial rated conventional 3/4 inch nozzle. And that's the key centerpiece of the new line of imploder products, and there'll be quite a few: super imploder, ultra imploder, triploder, and then there's magnetic devices to reinforce the effect, and lots of new toys. And these products, the new imploder, the imploder.com line, will begin to ship in about 4 to 6 weeks, 4 to 8 weeks.
That's just amazing. And also, you've been applying all these theories and these inventions into how to create plasma fields. And you can actually put them in a space, in a house, in a room, in your meditation place, and you can help in some way to create more coherence.
So we have like the Pyrify, in our
the plasma fire.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about this technology?
Yeah. So I don't know if I have one here, but if you make an electric field which makes the 2 pine cones kiss noses perfectly, it becomes centripetal, implosive, negentropic, and swelling reduction, inflammation reduction, and circulation increase. And originally, we put these frequencies in Therify.net. It's very wonderful and very powerful. And obviously at $30,000, this is not available to everybody. And now we have a dozen new ways to do this, really equally powerfully and so much more economically available to people. So the plasmafire.com, for example, those plasma tubes, that system is about around $2,500. And actually, because we're battery powered there, we can reach lower frequencies and increase the bandwidth of that cascade and run it in nature stuff. And also then we apply this to piezo devices very inexpensively. And this piezofire.com is my current favorite toy, actually. Even at the conference, I was the guy sitting there. You know what happened to me? I went to Medrick's birthday party, and there were like 30 people there who wanted to try it. And I'm like there, oh, well, you can play. I just turned it on. I didn't do anything. And one person had an infection in the ear, the other had a punctured eardrum, the other had a pain in the neck. And I mean, we had 30 different problems there. And every single person who tried this gadget walked away smiling and super happy. I mean, I was like, oh, I want to be a salesman for this gadget because it's cheap and it works. So it's implosive capacitance, piezo transducers, fed the conjugate cascade. And then there's a wafer of the super dielectric shungite functioning as a lens for that capacitance. And so you put these two very simple vibrators and you feed them the implosion cascade. And, for example, the first time we tried this, we had 2 people with serious hernia pain walked away happy after one session. I mean, okay. So localized pain especially, and localized circulation issues, the piezo-fire. And then we're launching a new line called firecrystal.com. Phire, firecrystal.com, which takes this, the piezo-fire, which is the ignition device for the classic fire crystal, how to trigger it. And then you can project that longitudinal wave coming out the center line of that hex piezo fire crystal. And that longitudinal wave, for example, will dramatically affect healing water, etc. And so we're launching that new line. We're just working on the cut crystal. But we have the ultimate trigger device for the fire crystal, which is piezo-fire. So yeah, we're having a lot of fun with our new toys.
Yeah,
amazing. And so as we're slowly wrapping up, I wanted to ask you, like, for the people listening, what actually brought you in your life to start looking into sacred geometry and study all these amazing subjects deeply?
Well, my phenomenology of perception professor said I had a fantastically analytical mind. So there I was in graduate school, and I really needed to figure out why life existed. And I was the builder of the polygraph in the psychophysiology clinic. And of course, I saw how graduate students, when they saw Playboy magazine, you measured their GSR off the charts. And so I knew there was a connection between what you want to touch and the electricity in your body. So the physics of emotion was my focus for at least 20 years. And I then worked with Manfred Clynes, who did, and you can read at goldenmean.info/touch, the geometry of change in pressure over time, defining emotion in the music literature measured 1,000,000 times. When you touch someone to say, I love you, the change in pressure over time reaches max at golden ratio. What does that tell you? Implosion. Is that geometry? Yes. And so would that make me curious? Yes, I needed to study this. So my graduate professor had invented the word biofeedback at the time, Al Axe, and I knew all those people, and I invented heart coherence and did the thing with Heart Math Institute, and long story. But anyway, yeah, I had a lot of fun, and I'm still young. Oh well.
And there is also one other subject that you share and you teach a lot, and I love it. And we also share with our audience and our students. And so that is all about the physics of bliss. So what you share with us is that to create bliss, in literally physically in the body, we have to get our brain waves and our heart waves ideally into coherence and in a golden ratio cascade. So my question to you is, because what we've been sharing with Arturo about life harmonics, which is creating harmonic inside of us, like in the body, in our emotions, in our spiritual energy, and also in our external environment, which is the external harmonics. And basically when you put those together is where the magic happens. Would you say that when we are living or even visiting spaces that have the highest fractality or harmonics in the space, would that aid us to have more bliss experiences?
Well, that's beautiful, and the answer is obvious. I always teach this by saying the bliss is a name for the charge radiance, which follows perfect compression. Like the rose doesn't unpack until first it learned how to pack perfectly. and when the aura is compressed implosively, the physics is you then emanate coherent longitudinal, the only physics of lucid dreaming and having a soul. So effectively, the effect of radiance, which follows implosion, golden ratio and brainwaves, is only the beginning. I'm reminded of our seminar in Australia about 20 years ago. The lady, we were measuring her brainwave before the break, and she could not make any alpha or anything fun in her brainwaves. She went out in the yard, actually, I think during the lunch break, and one of our teachers there was a shaman, and he helped her find her basically her childhood trauma. I mean, she really had messy stuff. She came back after the break, sat down at the brainwave machines, and it was this beautiful flowering tree, golden ratio harmonics up and down, incredible. And you could see she was smiling with bliss. So, it wasn't like we could tell her how to have bliss. No.
Oh.
But we could measure when she succeeded, and we knew what enabled her to succeed was obviously when you have trauma, you isolate parts of your memory, and when you pull yourself together, then the implosion.
So how do our spaces are they able to influence things like
Yes.
that? Our coherence, our bliss experiences?
Yes, and that would also imply that if people have access to serious sacred space, it would enable them to access their memory and their trauma. And literally, when you have trauma, you withdraw memory, and it creates a pocket of isolation in your memory, and that's loss of soul, literally. So you have to, haven't got time for the pain. Whereas when you get back into the place of implosion, like the birth canal or the temple, then you can reconstitute and regain and re-embed into that array, and then you have access to bliss, and your aura can unpack again like a flower.
Beautiful.
Amazing. Okay, so I don't know if you have any last words regarding all these amazing subjects that we covered today.
I hope that was a happily ever after. But I just remind people that the principle here, I won't let anyone tell me this was complicated. No, this is not a complicated subject. No, the electric field that is sacred space, that is bliss, that is bioarchitecture, simply needs to look like a rose, and then you're done. This is not a complicated question. It's like our friend Gary Skillen. He would make a magnetic map of everybody's bed, and he could tell who was sick. Rearrange the magnetic lines of your bed and your house and your village and your thought to look like a rose. This is
amazing.
Yeah, to create this implosive energy, this harmonic phi ratio implosive energy.
Exactly. And then we're distributed in that array, and that's the actual electrical definition of the word heaven, planes of Chiron, Champs-Élysées. That's what heaven is, perfected fractal distribution of charge, life force.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. We had some fun. I'm delighted to work with you anytime. This is a good work you're doing, making this teachable and shareable. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
So
it was great to have you. Thank you so much.
See you soon. I say hi to everybody out there. I'm available for your questions anytime. Blessings, blessings.
Wow. Welcome back, Dan. It was just a wonderful, amazing presentation. Thank you so much for sharing all this. So welcome back, Dan. We have many questions. People are very excited. They really love your work, and they love you so much.
Yeah, Dan Winter, guys, is the legend in sacred geometry, and so much more than that. But
I'm real time. I'm real time.
yeah, we know. Okay, so let's check some questions. So
yeah, Elda has a question. How many times do you recommend to visit like sacred structures or pyramids to have like that energy, like that? That force.
It's true. People spend all their money on vacations so they can get to sacred sites so they can feel something, which is nice. It's okay. But it probably is even more important that people have what Costantino called the place of power in their daily lives, someplace where they go to get recharged. It could be their altar in their apartment or the park nearby, wherever the place is where you feel the most charge and you can recharge your battery. You go there regularly, do your deep breath meditation, maybe sunrise, sunset, someplace where you get access to some form of bliss process, which is essential. And then the inner work of doing the bliss process. And it's fine to trigger that at sacred sites, wonderful. But you need access to this regularly in your daily life. That's the sort of summary.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I absolutely agree with you, Dan. And this is something like I do daily in my life. Like I have in our house, we have like a meditation room. This is like my place to recharge and reconnect and all that. And just to tap on that for people listening, again, remember we are not designing a whole house as a temple or a power spot. We need to have a specific area that is just for that, because we need a short exposure of that, not like being all day in that field. So that could be an external space of your house that is like a meditation or a healing space, or it can be one room in an existing place that you have, even in an apartment, and it's a dedicated place. And of course, the nice thing with that is when you also do meditation in a room that you have, you can have different technologies, you can have geometry, you can have different things that we will actually share in our next presentation after Dan, to create high space harmonics. But just meditating in one space every day adds layers to the field that is already there. And the result is, and I can tell you from my own experience and from measurements, that when you are back there, you tap into that field which you have already created. So it's even easier to do your practices, which is fantastic. Okay, so Vaika says, what can we do in our daily lives to increase life force energy within ourselves and in our spaces?
The source of my second major book, Implosion: Secret Science of Ecstasy and Immortality, is a book for the hygiene for bliss. goldenmean.info/conscious kids, and we divided that hygiene practice into 4 major areas, which are obvious, really. Of course, live food and the discipline of eating happy DNA, and the second was having a kinesthetic, that the actual physics of which yoga makes your hair stand up is a very specific practice of attracting charge, the sacred movement, the sacred dance, sacred gymnastic. And the third area was your location, which is just what this whole conference is about, that you find the place of power, which is implosive and centripetal, and you gather charge. Also related to that would be not just the place on the magnetic cross, but the timing. For example, sunrise, sunset, solstice, equinox. These are all places where 4-wave mixing, implosion. And in the fourth category, a little less obvious, is every single thought. The discipline of having a shareable thought means that every time you have any experience, particularly unpleasant experiences, you need to be able to distill that experience into the pure principle which will serve everyone when you die. In other words, what has the collective unconscious learned from my pain? In other words, the eureka, the moment your hair stands up, when you understand the principle behind. So actually, if you only thought shareable thoughts, pure principle, you were constantly distilling your life into pure principle, the kind of principle that when they implode into the collective unconscious will serve 1 billion memories and will serve survival memory for 1 billion years. Those kinds of thoughts do live forever. And if you only have those kinds of thoughts, you too will live forever, because your hair will always be standing up, you will always be imploding. In other words, think about what it means that every thought needs to be shareable. Then you will attract charge, and that's very attractive.
Yeah, Laurel has a question. Does the spin of the rise,
I'm not sure what she means.
need to go specifically clockwise or counterclockwise to create implosion? Maybe the spin of the charge, I guess.
Yes. I remind you that current physics does not have one clue to why every living protein enantiomorphically helically goes one way only. Up the down staircase is a movie that's a mystery. We do not know which way the staircase is supposed to go because we don't understand the principle, but I can give you a clue. The direction of helicity, that if the primal soup imploded to create the first living protein because of lightning, we can assume that the DC polarity that made the first protein out of primal soup was electrically centripetal and not centrifugal. Because if the DC polarity of the first lightning had been centrifugal, it would have blown the damn thing apart. So it is obvious that there is one direction of flux which is more centripetal than the other, and that is proven in the literature on which magnet heals, the north or the south pole. And by the way, it's profoundly confusing because the Chinese label it the opposite, and they make all the magnets, so it's very confusing. But to put it simply, the side of the magnet, which is the south pole, which is centripetal in our language, which is more centripetal, will make the pain worse, but accelerate the healing. Where the side of the magnet that's centrifugal, the negative side in our conventional language, will reduce the pain of your toothache, for example, but reduce the healing rate because the centripetal, you see, is the negentropic. So you can at least begin to think about there is a direction of helicity which is more centripetal than the other, as every designer of sacred dance from Sufi to Aboriginal knows.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Olga has a question. Does beauty have physics as bliss does? So from my side, I would say, Olga, first of all, golden ratio has been used in art and architecture for thousands of years because it creates beauty. And of course, it's a main ratio that we find in physics. So here you have like the first correlation of physics and beauty. What are your thoughts, Dan?
Well, you're right, of course, that golden ratio is classically defined beauty, and we now know why, because beauty is only a name for what is actually wave sustainability, ultimately, and therefore wave able to distribute, named heaven, for example. So distribution perfective defines beauty. And obviously that's about geometry. And so your hair stands up when you see beauty because you're absorbing charge, actually. So it does have everything to do with geometry. But so beauty was our name for the history of capacitance before we understood capacitance.
Yeah, completely. And then
I just wanted to add that there was a study for Olga's question many years ago that they analyzed the face geometry of famous people around the world, or people considered beautiful, and it was like, by definition, the ones that had the most golden ratio in their face they were considered really beautiful. And I remember actually Angelina Jolie had really close to perfection golden ratio in her face. Just an interesting
and the Russians did this. The Russians did an analysis. If you look at the angle of the eyes, you could actually determine if the person had bad intent or pure intent. And that turned out actually to be an implosive angle. That's all at goldenmean.info/Babylon, the pictures.
Awesome.
Awesome. I remember there is also another study from Dr. Marquardt that he made a whole mask. You know, people that want to have surgery and things like that, and they want to be like more beautiful in these terms.
Of course.
They were using those, drinks.
So, Andre asks, is it possible to put or buy, I don't know, maybe there's a mistake there, fire crystal for pain healing?
Yes, so firecrystal.com, P-H-I-R-E, firecrystal.com. You will see now the new 3D animation of the fire crystal. We're the only ones that actually teach the physics of how fire crystals work, which is obviously chargecollapseplankfire.com. And we're the only ones that offer the device to properly trigger the fire crystal, which is piezofire.com. And we know, and our partner on this, Tony Rodriguez, has shown that the crystal properly, you can use your body's resonance or you can use a piezofire. When the crystal is fired, there's a longitudinal coherence that comes out the tip. And as Tony's case is, you put that in water and his girlfriend was miraculously healed. So that coherent longitudinal focus imploded out the tip is the physics of why it heals water and you, because if the centripetal force is symmetric, then it will be implosive. So we know why and how fire crystals work, and we're the first to offer actual trigger mechanisms to accurately fire firecrystals.com. And the fire crystals, the first prototypes are coming in this week, and it's very exciting.
Amazing.
Oh, congratulations for that. Elda has a question. How is it possible to heal places that have been built with materials? I guess what she tried to say is that materials that are not as good as those that you recommend. You know, like normal houses built with industrialized materials.
Yeah, Valerie did some interesting research today, too, that in fact, if you had a large bulk of straw bale, for example, so straw bale would be, or hemp bale, high dielectric material in some mass. So you had a high dielectric in some mass, straw bale, hemp bale, anything like that. Hemp is beautiful dielectric. And so that you put that in some mass, and that will act as a beautiful buffer because it's extremely permissive to charge implosion. That which is destructive wave inertia basically doesn't get through. So a fairly high amount of bulk of high dielectric living material, like, carpets, which are beautifully dielectric and real living wool, ancient, whatever, a bulk of that. Another thing, obviously, is create your altar, your sacred space, your stone circle. Anything that makes implosion will sort. That's the beginning. We also know, for example, that our plasma tech, plasmafire.com, therify.net, implosive plasma, by measurement, will reduce electrosmog.
Yeah. People are asking if you can put in the chat those links.
Yeah, I'm putting it. That's okay. Cassia says, in which direction should energy flow around the navel?
Well, I would assume the navel would want to be centripetal. And if you just feel that intuitively, the clockwise motion around the navel would probably be more centripetal, as in, it's the spiral going within as opposed to counterclockwise, unpacking going out. Now that's intuitive, and there's lots of ways to interpret that. Even people deciding whether yin or yang means centripetal or centrifugal, there's arguments about that. But the point is, centripetal versus centrifugal is the issue, and your navel generally would need to be centripetal, I would think.
Last question.
Last question. Kaz says, thank you for such a fascinating talk. Can simply visualizing fractals and golden ratio patterns as seen in nature help heart coherence and overall well-being? Wow, that's a nice question.
Well, it's a beautiful question, and there's millions of examples, of course. The example I like best is when they're teaching the Steiner kids. They first must accurately draw the stages of the blossoming of the rose, right? Then when they can visualize from their accurate hand drawing of the stages of the blossoming of a rose, they close their eyes and have that very accurate visualization. And then the children pass the course if the room fills with the smell of roses. And we teach the physics of why that happens. It's the flowering brain, because that implosion in the brainwave's hologram is the physics of the infrared radiance, which is the physics of olfaction. So we know why the hummingbirds smash into the window of a sealed house when someone is having bliss inside. It's that infrared radiance. So
we have that a lot in our house, Dan, and we actually feel very sad because sometimes they bump on the windows and then
they smell.
I try to give them energy, and I put different things that I have, and most of them have survived, but I feel very sad. So you think that will happen because they feel the energy of the house here?
Well, it's actually very specific. The smell of bliss is mostly infrared, as Callahan proved, and that will go through the window, at least if it's a glass window. And so this is how the children filled this room with the smell of roses when their visualization was accurate. And by the way, the same Steiner school teaches that if you let your young kids spend their whole life in front of a computer screen, they lose the inner muscle to make a vision. And that means their access to creativity is pretty much destroyed for their life.
Yeah.
So, your kids need time to make their own visions. Otherwise, if they're in front of a device that's making all their visions for them when they're young, that inner muscle is gone. And that is very
You're so right, Dan. That's why we grew up with books, and that we were reading, or our parents were reading us stories, or we were reading, and then as kids, I remember, we were creating in our mind whatever the story was, the visual inside of our mind.
To make the vision inside, that is our access to the only physics of creativity, to create that implosion from within. And when the kids are stuck in front of a computer screen their whole life from 4 years old, that muscle never develops.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also the electromagnetic radiation of the phone
and
the machine.
And we developed that whole thing. At physicsofsoul.com, we go into that in great detail. So when you have access to bliss and your body radiates the coherent longitudinal array called physics of soul, and that inhabits not just a lucid dream, but where you go when you die. So developing that coherent longitudinal array, Ba from the Ka, Kesjan body, rainbow light body, is absolutely the physics of soul.com. And until we are able to teach our kids and our universities and our governments, billions of children are losing their soul daily on this planet because we don't teach what the physics of soul.com is.
Yes, absolutely.
Dan, thank you so much for this enlightening session. It's
Thank you for
absolutely
caring.
amazing to listen to you, and even just the information. I think every time we listen to you, and for people who are, there are shifts happening inside. So it's amazing. Thank you so
Been a
much.
blessing.
Yeah,
Thanks, guys.
thank you so much, Dan, and also Valerie, because
She's here smiling
you
too.
keep spreading all this love, this information, this knowledge, and also this wisdom. And for those that are new to this subject, it can take some time to go through layers of understanding, but just keep there, keep digging, keep understanding one concept, other concept, and then suddenly it clicks.
Exactly.
As I said in the presentation,
Just to say, our YouTube 500 films, 3 million views, Dan Winter Fractal Field. There's the array right there. Thank you.
Exactly. Yeah, you can go there and keep checking, Dan's work. It's just
Absolutely. Don't be overwhelmed. And I have to say, when I first discovered Dan, I don't know, it was over 15 years ago, I will say it very honestly, guys, I had to watch and rewatch the same thing. I don't even know how many times until I start getting it. So don't be overwhelmed. All the conference these 2 days, it's a lot of in-depth and complex subjects. So you keep re-listening and rereading, and you will get there eventually. So that's for today. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you. Blessings. Love you guys. See ya. Bye-bye. Bye.